Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's video. We will be covering what is known as the Battle of Hampton Roads. Those of you who know your history of the American Civil War will better remember the battle for being known as the Battle of the Monitor versus the Merrimack. We will briefly talk about some of the background context leading to the battle, the engagements of the two warships, and what the battle meant for both the Civil War's outcome and the development of naval history. The Union at the outset of the Civil War had placed a blockade on the entire Confederate coastline with the hope of restricting the ability of the Confederacy to secure trade relationships with European powers. This military operation would prove to be a testing ground for a new type of naval warship known as the Ironclad, one of the earliest forms of modern armored warship. This will be critical in determining the outcome of the Battle of Hampton Roads. On the afternoon of the 8th of March, 1862, the recently outfitted Confederate ironclad CSS Virginia, previously known as the USS Merrimack, initiated an attempt to break through the Union blockade near Hampton, Virginia. On this first day, the battle went very well for the Virginia and her escort. The cannons on the wooden Union warships present in the area could make little more than dents in the Virginia's armor, whereas the Virginia sunk several of the Union ships one by one. This got to such a point that the only Union ships that were not destroyed outright included the USS Minnesota, which ran aground later in the afternoon of that day. The only reason the Minnesota managed to survive was by avoiding fire from the Virginia and her escort fleet long enough to become protected by the dark of night. Once it had become too dark for her guns to be of any use, the Virginia and her escort fleet returned to port nearby for repairs. The following day, however, things would change for the Virginia, as at 9 p.m. on the 8th, well after dark, the USS Monitor arrived and took position near the Minnesota. The Virginia encountered the Monitor on the morning of March 9th as it returned to the area where the Minnesota had been grounded. The two ships began to engage each other when the Virginia fired a round at the Monitor meant to hit the Monitor, which ended up hitting the Minnesota. The Minnesota responded by firing its own volley of cannonballs. Following this, the two armored warships circled around each other, rammed into one another, and repeatedly fired shots back and forth at each other for several hours. This engagement was prolonged by the fact that neither ship was equipped with shell types that were strong or powerful enough to be able to breach the armored hull of the other warship. This engagement only ceased when the Virginia fired a shot that was lucky enough to strike the Monitor in her pilot house, causing the pilot to be blinded and thus forcing the Monitor herself to temporarily draw back. The Virginia herself, having sustained some damage on her own, once again returned to port for repairs. Oddly enough, the captains of both ships interpreted their respective fallbacks as retreats, thus prompting both sides to declare victory over the other. The outcome of the Battle of Hampton Roads was important in several ways with regard to the outcome of the Civil War in general, even if the battle itself ultimately amounted to a draw. It was strategically important for the Union because the Virginia had failed to accomplish its objective of breaking through the Union blockade. Had she successfully broken through the blockade before the arrival of the Monitor, the Virginia on her own could very well have threatened Washington, D.C. In the larger picture of the war overall, the failure of the Union to contain the Confederacy on land would have meant increased likeliness for the European powers such as the British Empire or France to open formal diplomatic and trade channels and relationships with the Confederacy. The Battle of Hampton Roads likewise marked a pivotal moment in the history of naval warfare. It was the first battle fought between two of these modern armored naval warships. The fact that both ships were able to fall back from the battle after sustaining relatively low amounts of damage between them compared to their accompanying wooden ships caught the attention of other major world powers. Seeing how potentially effective these types of ships were, the naval forces of countries such as France, the British Empire, and even non-European countries, such as Japan for example, began to suspend their construction of wooden ships in favor of constructing new armored ones.